My name is Matt Kistler, as she mentioned, and I'm presenting alongside Bryan Gouge, and we are members of Global Scripture Impact. That's that last word, GSI. So our work here within ABS is to help evaluate, to measure, to learn from what our projects are doing, learn about what our impact is. So as Harriet mentioned, Fred Barraza went out and collected 35 interviews among church leaders in 4 sites, 2 in Uganda, Kampala and Gulu, and 2 in Rwanda, Bugesera and Kigali. And just as a note, Gulu was an area heavily impacted by the Lord's Resistance Army civil war, and Bugesera was an area of intense genocidal violence. So the questions that were asked of the pastors were looking at how the trauma healing curriculum had impacted their ministry, how it had impacted their community, and what challenges they had faced. And as, again, Harriet mentioned, each site had 3 years of exposure, so we're hoping to see over time, how does trauma healing sink in within a community? So again, the purpose of these interviews was to get a better picture of how and why changes occur within communities once a trauma healing intervention is introduced. While the individual information that Grace presented focuses more on the scale of what happened within individuals, the data we're presenting now provides a narrative, a rich narrative of what it actually looks like as a community changes. So I'm going to pass things over to Bryan to share more about how we interpreted and analyzed these 35 surveys.
So Matt and I had the great privilege to be able to read through all of the experiences, the stories, the narratives of church leaders, of people in the community. And for me, that is what this is all about, looking at stories. That is what people hold on to, that's what they communicate, and it is the most rewarding part of doing research. It also happens to be the most challenging part of doing research because you're left with all of these experiences, and as a researcher, you're trying to understand what are the themes, what are the patterns, how is this all connected? So we sat down, and one of the ways that we went about doing that was first establishing a framework. How do we understand the data? We used a methodology called grounded theory, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics about that. Matt and I would be happy to talk later about what that means, but for us, this is a methodology I think that really works in cross-cultural settings because one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't have any preconceived biases about what you think is going to happen. You actually look at the data with very open eyes, with an open mind, and you don't look at it saying, I think these are the outcomes. You approach all of the experiences, the narratives, and you begin to read through, you begin to listen with a very humble posture, and then you begin to code or sort of tag what you think is being said here. What is the real essence of the story? So Matt and I kind of took all of the interviews, all of the stories, and split up, and we both began to read through them. And we began to pull some of the topics, some of the themes that we were noticing. One of the ways we did that was by, if any of you are in a conversation with somebody, and I know you could probably relate to, if somebody mentioned something 3 times, you're like, that's important, I should take note of that. So frequency was a way that we said, well, this came up 3 times, this is important, let's start to code that, let's start to kind of keep track of that. And the other one is by kind of how much affect or emotion or importance is being communicated in the story here. So what you'll see is some of these things, as we begin to look through, people would explicitly state, I began to spend more time with people in the community. I began to fellowship. Okay, that's very easy, that's explicit. But sometimes it was more implicit. You had to kind of pull from that. It wasn't said directly, but it seemed to be what they were talking about. So as you'll see here, on the right-hand side, you'll see the number of times. That's the number of times it was mentioned or this topic was mentioned throughout all of the interviews, which, I mean, I'm not going to go through every single one of those. Matt is going to unpack a little bit about what each of those mean. But you'll see some of them like fellowship, empathy, awareness. These kind of things popped up over and over and over again in the interviews, and we were really encouraged by that. So the next step was to, going back, take all of these themes, say, what do these have in common? Well, one of the things that we found was we grouped all of these themes with three larger things. These big themes were, how is this impacting the church? How is this impacting communities? Well, we split that up into three areas. Changes that happen within oneself, and that might be like awareness of trauma, awareness of yourself, being able to say, I'm sleeping better. That is an increased sense of awareness that you have about yourself and your sleep. And then movement toward God. And that kind of looked very differently. We grouped a lot of things into that, but one of the things that we saw was that where people held a view of God as distant, as separate from them in their suffering, after they experienced God as with them, present, connected. And then movement toward others, and that's sort of like interpersonal communication, interpersonal restoration. People were kind of crossing tribal lines. People were more than forgiveness, but coming to a place of reconciliation. So these are like the three themes, and then we had those more comprehensive, smaller topics that I talked about. Matt is going to come back up and talk about how we then all connected this together.
So hopefully you'll be getting a handout momentarily with this helix that we created. What we were trying to do, as Bryan mentioned, the challenge here is trying to take 35 interviews worth of information and communicate that. How do you tell that story in a simple way? And so what we saw, first of all, was that we had two different paths being walked. First was a path being taken by pastors and the churches they represented. Churches were changing. And then secondly, we saw how individuals were being impacted. Individuals were changing. And we saw a lot of points where they were changing in the same way, and then some places where, just by the nature of who they were, they changed differently. And so to kind of embody that, we decided to use this helix, which we sometimes add a little A in there for helix. Right, so that's our little joke. We use that shape to kind of describe this movement together as they move together toward a healing community. So I want to use the rest of our time just to briefly walk through this, because I do want to get to the discussion questions you'll see on the back so that you can be thinking about how this might be useful and applicable to your work. So as we start on the institutional pathway, which you see on the top, starting at the left there, the first place where leaders got introduced to the trauma healing curriculum was through equipping sessions primarily. And the first impact that they noticed was a greater awareness of themselves and their trauma. One, for example, gave this quote: "As a result of trauma healing, first of all, there's one thing I've really gotten about me. I have understood myself. I mean, I've also been traumatized in one way or another." And so as church leaders really began to understand themselves and their own trauma, their first shift was a growth in ministry and pastoral care. And so what we mean by here is pastors beginning to care more for their community, for their church community. And so this might look like one-on-one counseling sessions, or it might be, introducing people to the healing groups. Here's another quote that kind of embodied that idea. "Before, I never wanted to be close to people." This was a pastor. "I used to despise everybody. But these teachings are helping me to get close to church and serve others." So there was a real freedom to be able to re-engage with the church community by the leaders and by the churches. So the leaders represent the church. And so as people are meeting with their pastors, they're beginning to see, the church is with me on this. So as they begin to listen to others, leaders and the churches develop empathy, which then moves toward spreading trauma healing ministry and activism. So what do we mean by that? Now that they are thinking about trauma healing within the church, they take it out, right? They take it to their community. They start to think, this isn't just important for us here in the pews, this is important for everybody. So they start to think, how can we go to market with this? How can we go to a funeral and share this message? How can we go to the remote communities that we are far away from and share this idea? How can we even go to Muslim brothers or sisters? Many of them mentioned that this was an effective way to build bridges where, maybe other means might not be open, but talking about trauma was something that that could transcend those barriers. And so by the end, you see new vitality within the church. You see churches that are alive with growth. You saw salvations, increased scripture engagement, and just greater connection with the church. And as Grace mentioned, these are themes that you saw within the quantitative data as well. So really these two streams of data are complementary as you understand kind of what's happening at the individual level and at the community level. So now starting back at the left again with the individuals, they follow a very similar path. They understand their own trauma. That's kind of the first step. And then next, they start to open up. That was the one thing that was reported the most. People started to share their story more. And I think a lot of that has to do with the safe space that healing groups provide. So here's a quote. You see how people start behaving differently. You see how people start pouring out even things they had put aside or shelved. So as they share their stories together, individuals within communities build empathy for one another. They begin to understand one another, and that naturally leads you to a place of beginning to consider forgiveness and reconciliation. So that might look like, actually one of the primary ways we saw was families being reconciled, husbands and wives that had split apart or were really in a difficult place relationally, were able to come together and find healing there. We saw that across denomination, where churches that didn't work together before now had a forum and kind of a framework to understand and work together. And that could be cross-tribal, so that, in Rwanda, here you have Hutu and Tutsi. Now you started to see quotes about we're working together, we're worshiping together in ways we didn't before. Another quote, these people are back. They are active choir members. They're active members in the fellowship. For us as a church, we really appreciate that trauma healing program because we see them back and there's some stability. So once relationships are restored, people desire fellowship. They come back to church and they re-engage with their community and with their God. And so as you think about this helix as a combined entity, you see people moving from a place of isolation, from being disconnected, from being closed off, unable to share their story, to what we're calling a healing community, a place where individuals feel welcome, where they are together, and they feel free to share what they've experienced. So that is kind of the heart of the helix. Now I want to give a few disclaimers as we move forward. What we're representing here is what we saw in the data. And that was collected in East Africa. We do not claim or assume that it describes what any of you have been seeing or experiencing, which is of course equally valid. So I hope if any of you are saying, I don't know how much this fits for us, that's okay. We want this to be a starting place. Each context may have a different pattern of change. However, we do think there are some ways that you can use this, even if it doesn't entirely line up with what you've experienced, as you go back and continue to think and work and serve people through the trauma healing curriculum. So three things that we thought of is, one, refining this model. We would love for you to take this home, which is why we gave you a handout, and think about how can this be adapted to your context. We want you to try it, to think about it, to change it. Let us know, because that would be great too. So that what you see within your context can be kind of captured within this framework. And why do we want to do that? Because of the other two things. Using this kind of framework helps us develop mileposts and metrics for our programs. Ultimately, for many of us, I think the impact we want to see is not only at the individual level, as critical as that is. We want to see communities transformed by the power of Jesus Christ. And so we need ways to capture that. And by having a framework that looks at this community level change, you're able to start measuring these things so that we can learn and better serve, improve our performance together. So I think the Helix is a kind of a generative tool to start creating metrics. You know, you can just take what you have here and say, oh, well, how many is growth in ministry and pastoral care? Does that relate to my context? Well, let's start measuring it. Maybe that can be an indicator of change starting to happen within a community and help us know, this community need more support? Do we need to do something different to better help it get engaged? So I see the gong being struck and the cane coming out. So what we want to do is move to small group discussion, which the questions are on the back. How well does this framework communicate trauma healing in your community? We want you to think about this. And how might you change it to better fit your context? So we hope that you have some good discussion here. Again, people are going to, if you have questions for us or other questions for Grace and her team, you can write them down. People are going to go and collect them, and then after about 10 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A. So thank you very much.